What's happening, everybody? Jay Busbee, Kevin Kaduk, the latest Grandstanding podcast. And Kaduk, we're in the middle of March Madness, but right off in the distance, I can smell the grass. I can hear the crack of the bat. I can hear the scalpers yelping. It's almost baseball season.
Yeah, for your average sports fan, which we like to consider ourselves, it's always weird because you're so deep into college basketball and you're learning all the bench members of these teams that you haven't spent all year learning, and then you get that email. You've got your fantasy baseball draft coming up. So then you got to get caught up with everything on there. And as people may know, I was editor of Big League Stew for 5 or 6 seasons. So I knew everybody. I would always feel pretty good going into fantasy drafts, even without, doing that much research, just because I was like a sponge. I was taking it all in year round. Now it's different. I have a different job. And I had my draft on Wednesday, and I actually wanted to do this podcast because the theme of this podcast was, help, I've got my fantasy draft tonight, and I haven't done a damn thing. Help me, Andy Behrens. We've got Andy Behrens.
Ladies and gentlemen, Andy Behrens.
Too late to help, but he's here to help you.
So you guys are assuming that the rest of America cares about the tournament once Iowa is eliminated, huh? I had no idea. It's not the way it goes down in my house.
Well, I actually saw a couple of things on Facebook of like people who were rooting for all 3 Iowa teams and they got screwed 3 times. Is that allowable?
Well, that was kind of doomed from the start, right? I mean, nobody should be rooting for all 3 Iowa teams.
That's the only thing worse would have been a Texas fan.
Yeah, I didn't get it. Were you rooting for Northern Iowa and Iowa State? I mean, was it a? You can't, right?
I mean, certainly if you went to either Iowa State or Iowa, you're not going to root for the other. I don't have the thing as like a Big Ten fan where you can hate Michigan State all year and then all of a sudden you root for them in a bowl game or in the tournament. I don't feel that way, and I don't feel that way about Wisconsin either. Like
Really?
I actively don't like them, like for the whole year, and then I can't just do an about face and say, but go win a bowl game. I don't
Yeah.
know. I find it very difficult to flip that switch, so I don't normally.
But now that
do it.
the SEC has built this up and ESPN has so much money behind that, like you want to see SEC get kicked in the mouth no matter who it is, unless it's maybe Urban Meyer. Which
for sure, I can root against a lot of teams. I have no problem like entering a game, and rooting against both sides. But
The classic meteor game.
Yeah, I got no problem with that. I just can't, once my own team is eliminated from the tournament, it's really difficult.
So are you telling me that all of the research you'll be putting forth on this show came once the Hawkeyes were gone? I mean, that's when you started.
No, to be perfectly honest, I never had a lot of hope for the Hawkeyes, so there wasn't a lot of emotion invested there.
So this is the best information people are getting right now.
That's right. That's correct.
Yeah. So here's how it's going to work. I am going to do a very convincing impression of a complete idiot who does not play fantasy baseball, plays fantasy football a lot, but I've only tried fantasy baseball a couple of times. So I'm going to let Kevin pick your brain here for how to handle your fantasy draft and what to do, what to know going in. So roll with it, Kevin.
Yeah. All right. So someone's sitting down and really hasn't done anything. They probably know Mike Trout is good. They know Clayton Kershaw is good. But what's the approach here? I mean, obviously, I think the hardcore people are into auction draft, and we can talk a little bit about auction strategy in a bit. But I think if the casual fan is probably still doing the snake draft.
Right.
What's the best strategy to go into it? I mean, not without talking specific people, but how do you usually like to build a team?
Well, so a couple things that I would say that are just sort of generally important to know going into drafts this year. If you've been playing fantasy baseball, and this is something that we stressed throughout the preseason, that we stressed in our position primers, if you've been playing fantasy baseball for like 10, 12, 15 years, a lot of us have, the benchmarks, like the statistical plateaus that you used to consider really important, it's all different now, right? And some of this is PED related, and a huge piece of it is just the crazy expansion of the strike zone over the last few years. Like, there's a whole bunch of markers that used to seem really important that are now, they're all out of whack. Like, I think last year the average baseball team hit I think it was 140 home runs, and 10 years prior it was like 182. So that you're talking about 40 home runs that aren't there per year. or per team per yeah, that's crazy, right? That's crazy. So just a lot of the benchmarks are different. There were like 11 guys who hit 30 home runs last year.
Yeah, I'm in this keeper league that we do that we've done for probably 16 or 17 years, and we have these historical records of most home runs in a season, most RBI in a season. And you just sit there knowing that no one's ever going to get close to the 2001
Yeah,
season
they're
that
all
Frank
like oh
Schwab
two,
put
oh
up. Like,
four, stuff like that. You just can't reach them
yeah,
anymore. I'll tell you, the thing that really gets me is, and this was, in the Sabre community, if you're, like way into analytics or whatever, there's always a couple of like sort of quick and dirty. I want to find sleeper pitchers, so I look at things like, I mean, you basically want to look at like strikeouts and walks, right? You look at K to walk rate. That's a huge one for us. And the rule was always, if you can find a guy who's got a strikeout to walk rate of like 3 to 1, well, that's elite. That's great. Like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you'd find that there were only like a dozen guys in baseball who could do that. Last year, among qualified starters, there were like 51. like,
Jeez.
like everybody does it now. So like whatever your benchmarks were 10 years ago, you have to
Mhm.
like, shake the etch sketch, and it's totally different. Like, I mean, that was like half of all qualified starters are hitting a benchmark that used to be key for us. So now it's like the guy who said 5 to 1. Phil Hughes last year, over 11 strikeouts per walk. I mean, just silly numbers. So a lot of your markers have changed. That's a big thing to know. You'll find a lot of people who say that in almost everybody listening to this, almost everybody who's like prepping for a casual fantasy draft is playing in a mixed league, right, with both AL and NL players. My general approach in leagues like that, number one, if you have an auction, you gotta just buy stars, because those last guys that you use to fill out your bench, like the dollar guys, whatever, they're still going to be good. They're still going to be full timers. They're not. You're not going to have to worry about guys, being part of a platoon or whatever. I mean, in mixed leagues, I always go stars and scrubs. I don't see a better way to do it. If I'm in a draft, I get the numbers early. Like, I don't care about position. And there are a lot of analysts out there who, will talk up position scarcity, right? Like, there's only so many shortstops that you feel great about, only so many second basemen. But like this year in this era, like, power is just so hard to find. One guy hit 40 home runs last year, and he hit exactly 40. Like, power increasingly scarce, right? So it makes guys like Abreu, like Rizzo, Encarnacion, all those guys sneak into the first round, the second round, because you just can't find 35 home runs on the wire anymore. It just doesn't happen. Chris Carter gets interesting as like a mid-round pick, even though he's a disaster in batting average, right? Because nobody else is going to hit 35 home runs. Like, nobody does it.
Yeah.
It's why we're drafting Kris Bryant, like 60th overall, and he's not even going to be in the big leagues to start the season, because we think we might get 30 home runs there. It's just really hard to find. So I just get numbers early, and if that means that my first two picks are outfielders, or one's a first baseman and one's an outfielder, that's where I go, because you can't, there's no way that you can make up in the middle of the draft the opportunity cost if you think you're going to get tricky and you're taking I'm going to take the fourth best second baseman, in the second round because I want to make sure I fill that position. You'll never make up for it later on.
Touching on that, one of the cool features of the Yahoo Draft Room this year is that they actually have a tab that shows you your accumulated stats, at least projection wise. You can kind of know where you're at, and it's almost disheartening, and it's almost for because it will show you like what your place is in your league for that. But if you draft 5 outfielders to begin with, of course all your pitching stats are going to suck. So you can't say, oh my God, I'm in 10th. 5 picks into the draft. It just doesn't really work that way.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that, though, because that does become, like, as you hit the middle of a draft, say, that becomes super important. And I feel like a lot of drafters worry about filling positions. Oh, I haven't taken a pitcher in 3 rounds, whatever. But you should be focused on the categories, right? So you can make it to the middle of a draft and you feel like you've gotten value with every pick and you feel really good about it, but you got no steals, right? Like, that happens all the time, and it is a really useful tool. It's sometimes disheartening, and sometimes you want to argue with the projection tool, but it is really useful.
You mentioned the stat that you look for, the kind of secret stat, and maybe not so secret, but the walk to strikeout ratio for pitchers. What is it for hitters? What's the untapped stat that you like to keep an eye on?
I don't know if it's stuff that's untapped necessarily, but you do want to look for guys who, maybe they had a crazy home run spike that we shouldn't expect to be repeated, right? Like Michael Brantley's super valuable last year, and I would expect him to be really valuable this year too. I wouldn't expect the power number to be there exactly as it was, right? Like when you find guys where the home run to fly ball ratio just jumped somewhat unexpectedly, you would almost always expect that to regress a little bit. So that's something you look at. You look at guys who maybe posted a batting average on balls in play that is far ahead of anything they'd ever done, perhaps far ahead of anything they did in the minors. You just look for spikes like that. Generally speaking, with batters, sometimes a fantasy assets can be, you'll just look at the rankings, you'll look at the prior year's rankings. A guy can be totally batting average dependent, right? Like a ton of his value was in batting average, and that can come and go. That's a pretty fluky thing. So you do want to look at indicators like that. There's certain guys that just sort of scream out regression.
Who do you really have pegged for regression this year?
I think a couple guys that could be somewhat dangerous. Just based on, this is all based on where they go in drafts, right? Like, it's all about price. I mean, because the one thing that is always true in fantasy, regardless of sport, you're not gonna profit a whole lot on those first, second, third, fourth round picks. But you can't take a huge loss, right? You can't draft a guy in the fourth round who just is a total bust. That's sort of the path to ruin, right? So I'm steering away from, I see D Gordon had like a really great 6 weeks last year, and it propped up his entire season. And it's not like he can't have that again this year, but I don't like to bank on that. Like a huge percentage of his steals, and then he had that crazy batting average like in April and May, and then he was kind of a guy the rest of the season, fast but not he fell off the 100 steal pace pretty quickly, right? So I worry a little bit about him. I think probably Altuve gives some of the stats back from last year a little bit. I wouldn't expect him to hit for the same average. Mentioned Michael Brantley, but I still think Michael Brantley's going to be good, right? He's like the right age. He's got a little power and speed. I don't think it's going to be 20, 25 home runs this year. I would expect him to fall back to like 10 to 14. And if you can live with that with 20 steals and a good batting average, I think that's fine.
So one of the things that I have problems, whether it's picking March Madness, picking fantasy football, picking fantasy baseball, is that you like want to prove yourself right. Like you want to like find that sleeper. But the problem that you run into is that you pick like 5 of them or 6 of them. You know what I mean? So
that's really great.
This draft I did Wednesday night, I already had Kris Bryant as a keeper, which is not controversial at all, but I'm out there, picking up Taijuan Walker and Carlos Rodon and Micah Johnson. I'm probably going to run into trouble with that because not only am I not only kind of trying to strike gold in a lot of places, but I'm probably overcompensating with Chicago athletes, which has always been my problem in fantasy baseball. So how do you, as I know you're a passionate Chicago sports fan, but you have to be a dispassionate fantasy analyst, especially if you want to win leagues. So how do you balance those two things? One, wanting to be right, and two, your actual team allegiances.
Yeah, it's just a super weird thing about sports. I feel like in the last 5-10 years, right? There's that creeping futurism where we only really care about the guys that are next, and then once they arrive. Who cares, right? Like as soon as Bryant's up, we're all going to be talking about how much he strikes out, and we'll be over Kris Bryant. We'll be on to Joey Gallo, right? Like, sure, we're just that way. Your league is a little different because you're keeping players from year to year, and it's a mixed league. So in mixed leagues, you want to take a lot of flyers. You just want to like swing for the fences all the time and try to make sure that you're. If you think somebody has a shot to seriously break out and be a star in the year ahead, you gotta take your shots with those guys. And obviously in a keeper league, you got to take more shots with guys that you might have a chance to keep for the next decade. I mean, so I get it there. You don't want to be the guy who in just a standard draft, a redraft league where you're not keeping anybody. You don't want to be the guy who takes like 6 sleepers because that you'll feel like the smart guy in the room. And every time you draft one of them, the rest of the room is going to be like, "Oh, nice pick, nice." But well, the guy, usually the guy who draws all the nice picks in the draft room, that guy's terrible. That guy's like, sledge, like that's the surest sign.
So you just sit there and
they're
smirk
bust.
at him. You know you've got him.
You can't expect that you're going to hit on all of them. Now, the guys that you mentioned, like Taijuan Walker, nobody's hit him basically in spring training, right? He's battling.
Right.
Rotation spot, and isn't he up to like 18 scoreless innings, something like that? He may have given up 6 hits. I mean, nobody's touching him, and he has the prospect pedigree, so it sure looks like he's going to be great. It's hard to imagine that one going badly. It's hard to imagine Kris Bryant going badly. Rodon is filthy, but we don't know when he's going to be up. So then you get into the problem of, okay, I've hoarded all these prospects, but I can't play them until, well, maybe they'll be up in late April. Okay, they're not up. Maybe they'll be up in late May. Not yet. Maybe they're playing the Super 2 thing. So that gets really hard to manage around. But again, in a keeper league, it's worth it. But in a standard redraft league, you just can't do it. You gotta just pick a number. Like, I'm going to limit myself to 3. Micah Johnson was an interesting name to throw out too. So he cannot defend his position. So I guess that would be the worry there.
But he has Robin Ventura as a manager, so maybe he will be out there. I don't know.
I know. He's hit like crazy in spring, and he's super fast, so you can see the fantasy utility there. And then he's just a butcher in the field. So, is he a guy who will start and play 6 innings and then get lifted for Gordon Beckham? Is he a guy who, I don't know, is he a guy that they send down to work on defense?
Yeah. That was a 25th round pick because I just didn't know what else to do, and I wanted a nice pick, but I don't think anyone gave me the nice pick. So
you dodged that one.
The next logical question I have, though, is you've got these guys, they come up, they struggle, and let's not even say it doesn't even have to be a prospect, but it can also be, a mid-round pick that you felt high on. When do you pull the plug? Because I think everyone has a story of getting burned pretty early on, and then dumping it and then regretting it much later in the season.
Yeah, that all gets tied to like how deep your bench is, right? Like if you've got 6 bench spots and you can stash a guy while he works some things out, great, you can do it. If I play in a couple leagues where we start like 20 some players in any given week, and we've got like 3 bench spots. So you can't hold on to a guy who's scuffling. You just have to be ready to kick him to the curb, and it's hard to do that with players that you have a lot of optimism for in the preseason that you've kind of pegged your hopes to, and then they're a dud for a month. Part of this too is how patient is a team going to be? I'm remembering like Josh Rutledge a couple of years ago. He was like America's favorite fantasy sleeper because he had a great September in Colorado, and then he starts out the season.
That always works out.
Yeah, he's a total disaster for them for like a month, and the team had no reason to be patient with him. So he was down in no time. He was back in the minors by May. If it's a situation like that where that a guy has to hit right out of the gate in order to keep a job, I'd have a really quick trigger with him. But if it's a situation where this is a gem of a, like, let's say Kris Bryant comes up and there's a week in which like Billy Hamilton was a super slow start last year. Maybe Kris Bryant comes up and he's 0 for 4 in his first 3 games, and there's going to be people who are like, oh my God, he's not ready. Well, that's 3 games. But variance just trumps everything, and randomness trumps everything in baseball, right? Like you can't make judgments off of a single at bat. You can't make judgments off of 2 games, 3 games. So a guy like that, you have to be endlessly patient with, because the organization's going to be endlessly patient with him.
Now you mentioned the stars and scrubs philosophy with auction drafts. Do you set a percentage in mind for how much to spend on? If you've got a Mike Trout, if you've got a McCutchen right there for you to bid on, do you set a percentage for, say, all right, I'm going to spend this much of my bankroll on this guy?
I really would only do that in an only league, right? Like you're in an AL only league. I just had an auction for one of these over the weekend. There you've got to set pretty tight budgets, and you have to realize the impact that it's going to have downstream if you end up spending like 45 of 260 units on a guy. I mean, that's really hard to make up for in a league where where everybody's gonna end up starting some platoon players, stuff like that. But in a mixed league, which is what most of our folks play, you've just got to, hey, if Mike Trout's going to cost $60, then I'm probably still going to buy Mike Trout, because I know that the worst outfielder who starts for any team in a 12-team mixed league is still going to be pretty good. And I know that certain positions, first base, outfield, starting pitcher, in a mixed league, usually saves, relief pitcher, there's going to be all kinds of stats and all kinds of good players who sort of come into the player pool throughout the season, and a little bit of experience teaches you that you can always find, if you leave your starting pitchers somewhat incomplete in a mixed league, it's no big deal. You'll find a starting pitcher as long as you're a reasonably active owner. You'll find an outfielder as long as you're a reasonably active owner. You can find steals, you can find saves. I mean, there's just certain things that come into the league that go undrafted. The problem is when you're in, maybe you're in a 12-team AL only league, there's 2 catchers, there's 5 outfielders, stuff like that. Then nothing is going to come into the league. All the best prospects are going to be drafted. All the setup men are going to be drafted. Everybody's going to be owned. And in a league like that, you have to be really stingy with the stars. But in a mixed league, you just gotta get 2 or 3 of them. It doesn't have to be Mike Trout, right? I wouldn't be like Mike Trout or bust in a mixed league. But if I didn't get Trout, I would make sure that I got Goldschmidt, that I got I want to get 2 first rounders if I'm in an auction, something like that. I want to feel like I've really landed, my stars are great, and then I can kind of sketch in the rest of the roster throughout the season.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned that pitching strategy, because I've never liked to overdraft on pitching. Probably not going to blow a budget on Clayton Kershaw. I love the guy. I love watching him.
Right.
I just feel like it's something that you can put together down the way. I'd much rather have those positional stars.
The one nice thing about guys and we've sort of always said in fantasy that, and it's true, that there's a lot of variance year to year in pitching stats, and there's a lot of luck that goes into it, and there's always breakouts, and there's always guys that come up and they have a really nice run for a couple months, and you can kind of always find it throughout the season. Those elite guys, except for in cases of injury, those guys are there year after year. I put together our position tiers for every position every year, and the same pitchers that were in the top tier 3 years ago are still in the top tier. Sure. Those guys hold their value. There's no, you can think of Verlander as an exception, and there are always exceptions, right? There's guys who suffer injuries, who lose velocity, but those upper tiers look an awful lot like they did, in 2011, 2012. So those guys Kershaw is going to be great in 2 years. There's not a lot of worry there.
I'm tearfully looking at my Tim Lincecum poster right now.
Yeah, that's a huge, starters who lose, and everybody loses velocity, right? It's one of those things that probably peaks. It's one of those player traits that probably peaks the day you come into the league. Almost everybody loses velocity, but when a guy loses that much, when you go from 98 to 90, it's really hard to be successful.
Lincecum was one of those guys who I loved for so much, and I was in this keeper league and I never had him, and I wanted him so bad, and then of course he fell and he was available, and I just picked him up on my team just because I wanted to own him. It was one of those things.
Super dangerous, right? And I think a lot of people have done that with Lincecum, right? I've chased him for years and years, and finally there he is on the way.
I wasn't expecting even much though. It's just sometimes you just want to follow a guy and have him on your team, and this is why I'm never any good at fantasy baseball.
You're like Peter Angelos, man. You're just collecting guys just to have them. All right, this is the point in the interview where if it were some retired star, we'd say, so by the way, tell us about your new project that you're working on, and shoehorn that into an ugly conversation. But let's go corporate here for a second.
Tell us what you're doing with these Kellogg's brand cereals.
Exactly. Yeah. Tell us about your relationship with the Kellogg's brand. Talk about Yahoo's fantasy offerings this year, why Yahoo kicks everybody's ass. What can people look forward to out of Yahoo's fantasy baseball season?
We have a new draft room this year, and I think it's pretty great. The feature that Kevin mentioned at the top is one of my favorites. The ability to track our projections as you're drafting is just a crazy nice tool. And it's not the initial tab that you see, right? So you have to kind of have to kind of look around for it, and not everybody in the room is going to be using it. So, great advantage there. One thing that we've done at Yahoo over the last 3 years, I would say, as we've expanded our ability to serve keeper league owners, dynasty league owners, we have a pretty great player pool now. Like anybody that you'll find in whatever the Baseball America, any top prospect list, if you're looking down a top 50, top 100 prospect list, you're going to find those guys in our game. That wasn't the case. I mean, people who've played at Yahoo for a long time know that 10 years ago, you were not going to find those guys in the Yahoo player pool in all likelihood until they actually came up and got at bats. They're there now. So we're a great place to host your dynasty league, your keeper league. We keep all that for you all season. We've got your league histories there for you. So that's kind of been my pet project too over the last few years, and I'm really happy with where the player pool has arrived for baseball. And then of course we have the most intuitive game and the most easy to use game. So I really like what we're offering this year, and I really like our draft room especially.
Is Deion Sanders in the players pool?
Man, the names that hang in there for years and years are like Mike Jacobs is probably still in the player pool. There's just some random.
I only asked because I remember in 2001 waiting for Deion Sanders to be added to a waiver. I assume I was playing at Yahoo at the time. I just remember Deion Sanders. He came back for that one season after not playing for 5 years, and I said, he's gonna have all these steals, and I put it in a claim and was horribly disappointed.
Oh, waiting for the prospects who came up in Yahoo to hit. Who was it? It was Jesse Fopper was the big one. Years ago. Sure. We all stayed up until 2 a.m. to see if because I was in a league where he just became whatever.
Is that a real name? Jesse Fopper.
Oh, he was terrible too. He was immediately terrible, and he was had a crazy minor league K rate.
I'm calling him up on Baseball Reference.
Find out.
Oh my gosh.
While he's doing that, I've just got one more question here. When you go to a live baseball game, are you able to enjoy it at all, or are you watching? Is it like the Terminator when a guy makes a play and you instantly see stats reeling off little LED stats above his head?
It's not. It's. I don't get an opportunity to go to a lot of live football games, obviously, because I'm usually on camera or I'm writing at the time, but. Football is the thing for me where I have such a vast portfolio that I can't even root. I have shares in everybody. Every game that I watch, I'm facing that guy and I own that guy. This last year was over 20 teams in football. So I had shares all over the place. So it became impossible to root for anything. And once the Bears had sort of verified that they were horrible, there's nothing to root for me. I couldn't even put on my hometown fan hat and be a Bears fan. You had to distance yourself from that team. So football, it's really hard for me. Baseball, not so much. I play a much smaller collection of leagues. In baseball, I tend to be more you always like to say that you go into a draft or an auction and you're going to be not so tied to the name. You're going to just care about the stats and you're going to be emotionless. But I do end up collecting a lot of shares of the same player, whether that's, I'm more bullish or bearish on them relative to the mob. I don't know. But I do collect a lot of the same players, and I try now only to play 5 baseball leagues. So I tend to get a lot of the same names.
I can't even do 2. How do you do 5? What is
three of them will be weekly transactions. So that's the thing about your sort of default league at Yahoo, right? For baseball is it's work. It's so much harder than football. From a playing the game standpoint, sometimes it's like chess versus checkers, right? You're making moves every day. You have to pay attention to which closer in a West Coast game got lit up last night and who might be the guy who takes over for him. It's work. You got to check in a couple times a day. Football, you can win a league checking in once a week, no problem. But baseball is quite a bit more work. So 3 of these leagues, I can only make transactions once a week. And we set the lineup on Monday and then we just go. So that makes it so much easier because you can't, as much as I want to sweat over details and waiver claims and all that, doesn't make a bit of difference.
You've got a life too.
All on Sunday. Yeah.
What's how many shares of Kris Bryant do you own, and how do you project him?
It's hard to find him. It's hard to get him this year. There's one league where I've owned him for 2 seasons just waiting. So that's been going on, and his salary in that one is kind of at a crazy level, and I have him in one more. I've had him in my, I feel like I'm actually really bullish on him relative to other fantasy writers. I think I have him 9th in my third base ranks right now, which is well ahead of the sort of industry average. It's still hard to get him. Because again, we talked about at the top, power is so scarce right now. Nelson Cruz hit 40 home runs last year. Nobody else did. But Bryant 43 in the high minors. The other thing about Bryant is, and I don't know how many cases there are of players like this, but so he was the consensus minor league player of the year last year, Arizona Fall League MVP. The year before that, he's like the Golden Spikes winner. He was everybody's amateur player of the year. Like, it's been a really long time since Kris Bryant was not the very best player at his level, whatever his level was. So I know he strikes out a bunch. It's really hard for me to imagine that he's not going to hit a ton when he comes into the league.
After what Baez did in last year's debut, I think any strikeout rate will be kind of fine with anybody, fantasy
right, exactly.
At what point does a guy jump onto the wireless? I mean, at what point can you start buying shares of his future?
With a guy like Bryant.
Yeah. When in the minor league process does he enter the Yahoo the machine?
So we've had him, basically from opening day last year. As soon as the game launched last year, he was in our player pool because he was so clearly one of the better prospects in baseball. And we're really, really good about having, whoever those guys are, top 50, top 100 prospects. They're all in there.
Yeah.
But it was painful last year because I think we all expected, maybe we'd get a look at him in September. Certainly, his agent did, right? Like everybody thought, the minor league player of the year should probably be up in September, and he wasn't. So he was the guy that you carried for like 2 months, and then there was no payoff.
It's funny how big of a story. I mean, there's probably haven't been many spring training stories bigger than Kris Bryant and the war between Theo Epstein and Scott Boras, and it's funny how big of a story it is now, and what a minor footnote it will end up being in the whole scheme of things, 10 years down the road, or even 2, 3, or 4 years.
Like a little bit of it is, there are some voices in like local Chicago media
no,
just don't get it.
They're so unfamiliar with Super 2, couldn't explain to you what Super 2 is, completely unaware that this has happened with like every other big prospect in the last however many years. They just don't come through Chicago, so it's like this sort of new thing for Cubs fans.
And they seem convinced that it's so obvious that Kris Bryant, for people who don't know, the most likely scenario with Kris Bryant, right, is that he misses like the first 12 days of the major league season, which ends up being 9 or 10 games, which over the course of a long baseball season is, that's almost nothing. And we have all these local writers who are throwing out.
Convinced it's going to cost them a playoff.
Yeah, that's gonna mean 2 wins, 3 wins, and it's going to cost them the World Series this year. I mean, that's so preposterous. And the payoff, if you just wait, 2 weeks, is that you get a full season of the guy under team control when he's theoretically at his absolute peak, right? You're buying his age 29 season or something like that for 2 weeks in April in what would be his rookie year. It's a super easy decision. It's an incredible
in a Wrigley Field that is decimated and probably won't have an outfield fence.
Right.
Runs.
It's the easiest decision in the world, and people are talking about it as if it's just so controversial. And how can they sacrifice this season of all seasons? It's terrible. We deserve better than that, I think.
You're a Cubs fan, a Cubs season ticket holder. How excited are you right now?
Oh, it's you don't want to get too far like over your skis on this, right? Because the thing is, last year, the year before, when they had the affiliation with the Kane County Cougars, I was going out there and you'd see a lot of saw Almora there, I saw Vogelbach there. The thing that people may not get about their farm system is that there are guys in the Cubs farm system who rank like 15, 16, who would be the gem of any other system, right? Yeah. Like they're never going to have a spot for Dan Vogelbach. He sure looks like a DH, but that kid hits, every time you go see him, there's going to be at least one missile. It might go foul, it might whatever. I mean, that kid just hits rockets. and we're never going to see him in a Cub uniform. And I don't know, is he the 12th best prospect in the organization? But that kid is great. The outfielder they got in the Russell deal last year, great. McKinney. They're stacked. They're really stacked. The young pitchers they drafted last year, who we won't see for a while, they for sure are built to make an extended run. Because the one thing that you've experienced as a Cub fan is that they have these fluky great seasons. And, what you need to do, obviously, to win World Series is to just get yourself to the playoffs again and again and again, year after year.
It worked for the Braves. It worked for the Braves.
Yeah. I mean,
you saw all the World Series they brought in.
That hurts, Kevin.
Well, I mean, but it did work. Like, they got something out of it, and that would just be awesome to experience, like, just a solid decade of attention and playoff berths, and that's what we've always missed, right? Like, there's always the outlier season, and the guys get paid forever, and they show up at Cubs convention forever because you're an '84 Cub or an '89 Cub or whatever. But we've never had a sustained just run of success, and you just enter every spring knowing, okay, this is going to be an 88 to 95 win team. We want that. That's what we want. They seem so close, and they have the right management team too.
Well, Chicago got a little bit of a taste of that with the Blackhawks and the way that organization has been able to produce and develop such talent. And to me, coming to this Cubs season, I'm just excited to actually care about the games. I mean, the last 3 or 4 years were just so brutal. And the fact that it's like, okay, you could turn on the game, but like for what? Like, what return were you going to get on your investment? Because these weren't going to be the guys that are going to end up making the long run. They weren't winning baseball games. It was just this mess, and it was the sort of thing where it's like, okay, if I'm going to turn on the TV and watch a baseball game, am I going to turn this on? Or in the age of MLB TV, am I going to actually turn on an actual good team that's a little bit more enjoyable to watch?
Yeah, it is super weird to be in the situation where, like, you're rooting for – you want Jason Hamill to have a good start, not because you care about today's game, but you care about his pre-deadline trade value, right? Like, that's what you've been rooting for, Yeah.
But that brings up a point. What would it take for Chicago fans to turn on the Cubs? I mean, you guys go through, you will survive plagues and fire and every other biblical nightmare. What would it finally take for you to go, all right, enough, I'm done with the Cubs?
Wow,
I don't think it's possible.
Yeah, I don't think it's short of actually leaving the city. If the Cubs did some weird thing where they, and obviously ownership was smart enough not to really hold out a move to the suburbs.
Move to Los Angeles.
Yeah. I mean, short of that, there's really nothing. I mean, what we've already survived is so significant. I mean, a century of waiting.
Sunk cost.
Nobody's going to give up. Yeah. We're certainly all pot committed at this point.
Hey, kind of wrapping things up here, but I wanted to get your thoughts, big picture-wise, on where fantasy baseball is right now. Obviously, it's never going to be fantasy football, but we're in a position where baseball has been kind of threatened by the short attention span of the average American consumer, and I assume that would also be hold true for fantasy baseball. Now, there's also another threat towards fantasy baseball with these daily games, which gives people a lot shorter window to pay attention and a much quicker reward. Where do you see fantasy baseball? Where is it now? Where is it going? Do you see a lot of changes happening? Is there something a Yahoo or ESPN or any other fantasy provider can do to make it get more people through the door?
Well, first of all, the core audience is super loyal. People who are baseball fans, like hardcore baseball fans, and certainly one of the nice things, just as somebody who works in the fantasy industry over the last few years, one of the nice things is that we've now reached a point where, like, if you consider yourself a hardcore fan, there's a very fundamental expectation that you're playing fantasy, and that's true in football, it's true in baseball, and that's pretty gratifying, right? Like, there used to be this divide between the fantasy geeks and the real fans, and now you can't be a real fan without playing fantasy, so that's awesome. Like, there's just not a lot of people give up their core fantasy sport, whatever it is. So the numbers of users certainly hold steady from year to year. I don't really view, and I don't think a lot of the numbers support the idea that daily is any kind of threat to the standard fantasy game. If anything, it's a thing that you can do when you feel like your team has fallen out of it, right? There's a lot of that. I mean, it's just another way to sort of augment your fantasy portfolio a little bit. And maybe it's June and you're in a rotisserie league and you're pretty, you're in the middle of the pack and you don't think you're going to win the thing. You can drift over to daily fantasy and play some of those games and still stay plugged in. Not to sound like too much of like a Chicago homer or anything like that, but it will be huge for baseball for the Cubs to be good. Like if they really pull this off and they are legitimately a good team, like a deep playoff run sort of team for the next 10 years or whatever, like people forget when the Cubs were in the playoffs, even with those sort of disastrous exits, right? The Mark DeRosa teams, whatever. When the Cubs are in the playoffs, they bump the Yankees to the day games, right? Like the audience for the Cubs in the playoffs, and maybe if they make it year after year after year, it'll become, commonplace and nobody will be wowed by it anymore. But that is, to me, that seems like if I'm the commissioner of baseball, I want to do anything I possibly can to smooth out the landscape for the Cubs to get into the postseason because the ratings are like no other when the Cubs are there. That's a huge deal for them. So I think that's good for baseball. It'll be good for baseball's audience. It'll bring in a lot of casual fans. Certainly there's, like a billion casual Cubs fans out there just sort of waiting to
board that bandwagon.
So that to me is a huge thing for baseball's popularity because it's not, we're not going to go back to the way things were in the late 90s, 2000. Like that is a problem for baseball, right? Like as much as people say, oh, I hate that we suffered through the PED era, what a bunch of cheaters. Yeah. It was awesome, right? Like you gave people that and it was great. And, there was a pretty decent chance that you were going to see a 13-11 game anytime you showed up at the park and people liked it. And now, it's not there anymore.
Well, they definitely need to do a better job marketing their stars because all they've done, I think Jeff Passan has written pretty brilliantly on this, is they've just spent the last 10 or 15 years assassinating their stars in the PED witch hunt. So if you can get that turned around and someone like a Kris Bryant really becomes a face of a city and you've got Mike Trout and Clayton Kershaw leading the Los Angeles market forever, and maybe Matt Harvey kind of becomes the big celebrity out in New York.
It would help if Harper popped too, because that guy, what a great, you could just tell people like it would be fun to like either hate him or love him, right? Like there's a handful of stars out there that you could really promote the heck out of for the next like 10, 15 years.
Look at this March Madness. I mean, people are watching to see if Kentucky wins or loses. Every sport can use that team and or star. Right. It's controversial. And A-Rod still moves the needle. He still clicks for us, but not for much longer.
Right. I really thought Iowa had the answer to Kentucky.
You're making us question your sports acumen there, dude.
Oh, you guys obviously didn't see enough Aaron White.
Thanks for hanging with us, man. You good, Kevin? You ready for your next draft?
I want to get Andy's season tickets and see which games he can mark me down for this year.
Yeah, you gotta. Between me and Friedel, you should be taken care of.
I think I've told you this off the air, but there's gonna be so many people that come by and say they've been with the Cubs through thick and thin, and they're the biggest diehard Cubs fans, which to me is the most annoying part about following the Cubs, is the people who just want to prove to you that they're the biggest Cubs fan, right? Like those people are unbearable. And I actually said, there was a couple of games over these last 4 years, there'd be like a rain delay, and it would go like 18 innings against the Pirates, and they'd let out at like 2:30 in the morning. I said that at the end of those games, they should have handed like a certificate to everyone walking out of Wrigley Field saying, you are the only person that can claim that you were here with the Cubs the entire time.
That's
seriously
great.
Like 1,100 people in the crowd by the time.
Yeah. Do you remember like they used to have this thing for the Giants? Like if you got to the end of an extra inning night game at Candlestick Park, they used to give you this little pin, and it would signify that you were a really big Giants fan, because if you were able to stick through the wind and the cold at Candlestick Point, you obviously had to be a diehard Giants fan. And if they ever like show up on eBay, they go for like hundreds of dollars.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's a good move. I have sat through a couple games where you get that second seventh inning stretch. That's always that's a kick in the teeth.
And they stop selling beer, and then once they do that, everyone kind of filters out.
You've completely sobered up by the time that the second one comes around. You're stretched out over 3 seats. Yeah, it's great stuff.
It's going to be a fun season. I'm pretty pumped. It's going to be weird watching those games at Wrigley Field with the outfield a mess, but I think people are making a little bit.
Yeah, we don't know exactly how the park is going to play either. That's like a big thing that nobody's. I mean, Wrigley is always kind of 2 parks anyway, depending on which way the wind has been blowing. But I mean, but they're putting up a lot of stuff in the outfield that should impact the way the park plays. So that's kind of a little bit of a mystery as well.
It's going to be weird. I'm in a little bit of mourning for the Ball Hawks. I spent a lot of time with them in the summer that I wrote that book, and it was it's such a cool atmosphere to actually watch a game out there. And even when I lived close to the park, sometimes I would just go out there and stand outside just because you had nothing else to do, and it was a fun way to follow a baseball game or watch it. But that era is over, so I think that's the biggest change. But I think we can both agree that park needs a few changes and a few adjustments to the comfort level. Because...
it's crazy to walk through when there's safety netting above you to catch falling concrete everywhere.
Guys, you need to take the Atlanta approach. The moment that you get a slight ding on it, you move 12 miles up the road. Well, thanks a lot for hanging, Andy. Appreciate it. And I think I'm going to go jump in some anonymous. I'm going to make up a fake name now and hide and join into anonymous draft.
Busbee.
Yeah, exactly.
Make it really easy now to jump into the draft room at any time. So
cool.
Anytime you get a little inkling, you can jump in.
Well, find Andy Behrens on Twitter. It's just at Andy Behrens. Am I correct in that?
Yes, sir.
And he would love to hear all about your Cubs fandom. He and Kevin both, at Kevin Kaduk, would love to hear how big a Cubs fan you are. So find them. Look for our Grandstanding podcast. We talked to Danny Manning yesterday. We got a few more coming up next week. Find us on iTunes. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. For Kevin Kaduk, I am Jay Busbee. This is Grandstanding. See you next week.